My mother stood up at the end of the Thanksgiving table, tapped her wine glass with a fork like she was about to announce an engagement, and said, "I think it's time this family knew the truth about Danielle and the $22,000 she never paid back." 14 people went quiet. My fork stopped halfway to my mouth. My Aunt Pam's husband actually laughed, thinking it was a joke, before he saw my face and stopped. "Mom," I said, "what are you talking about?" "You know exactly what I'm talking about," she said, smiling the smile she uses when she wants an audience to think she's the reasonable one. "The loan your father and I gave you in 2018 for grad school. You never paid us back a dime, and now you want an equal third of Grandma's estate like you didn't already take yours 7 years ago." I want to be clear about something before I go any further. I paid that loan back, every dollar of it, in 19 separate checks over 20 months, ending in November of 2020. I know that because I still had the check register. What I didn't have yet, what I wouldn't find for another 11 days, was proof my mother had known that the entire time. My name is Danielle Voss. I'm 34. I'm a project manager for a hospital network in Columbus, Ohio. And until that Thanksgiving, I would have told you my mother and I had a complicated but functional relationship. The kind where you don't talk about money, politics, or my brother Marcus, and everything stays civil. That night, in front of my aunt, my uncle, my cousin Whitney, and my mother's book club friend who'd apparently been invited for reasons no one explained, my mother turned 20 months of canceled checks into a story about a daughter who took her parents' money and never looked back. Here's the part that made it worse. This wasn't just gossip. This was happening 3 weeks before the reading of my grandmother's trust, the trust that named me, my brother Marcus, and my cousin Whitney as equal 1/3 beneficiaries. My mother, Carol, was the trustee, which meant she wasn't just embarrassing me at a dinner table. She was laying groundwork. She was building a reason, in front of witnesses, for why my third of the inheritance should look a lot smaller than everyone else's. I didn't say much that night. I said the loan was paid off. My mother said that's not what the records show, and my father, who would have settled this in about 4 seconds, because he was the one who actually kept the records, had been dead for 3 years. Quick thing before I go further, because I ask this in every video and I genuinely love reading the answers. Where are you watching from tonight, and is it as cold there as it is here in Ohio right now? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one and it helps more than you'd think. Okay, back to it. I drove home that night replaying the last time I remembered actually finishing that loan off. November 2020, a Tuesday, I'd mailed the last check number 1147 from my Huntington Bank account, with a note that said last one. Thank you both. My dad had texted back a single word, received. That was it. That was our whole family's love language, efficient and quiet. So when my mother stood up and rewrote that history in front of 14 people, my first feeling wasn't even anger. It was disorientation, like someone telling you your own childhood happened differently than you remember it. It took me 11 days to understand that my mother wasn't misremembering anything. She remembered it perfectly. And the story she told at that table wasn't the first draft of a lie. It was the final polish on one she'd been building for months, for a reason that had nothing to do with me at all. The Monday after Thanksgiving, I called my father's old bank branch, the same Huntington location he and my mother had used for 30 years, and asked if there was any way to pull archived images of canceled checks from a joint account, specifically checks I had written to that account between March 2019 and November 2020. The woman on the phone, a branch manager named Renata, was kind about it in the way people are kind when they can tell you're trying not to cry in a hospital parking lot during your lunch break. She told me personal account records that old wouldn't show up in online banking, but Huntington kept 7 years of check images archived, and I could request them formally since I was named on several of the checks as the writer, even though the account itself was my parents'. It took 9 business days. I want to be honest about that, because these things never move as fast as you want them to. 9 days of going to work, running status meetings about surgical scheduling software, and coming home to check my email 15 times a night hoping for a PDF. When it finally landed, it was 19 scanned images, front and back, dates ranging from March 14, 2019 to November 3, 2020. Total $22,400, exactly matching the number my mother had said out loud at Thanksgiving, which told me something important: she hadn't invented the debt. she knew the real number. She just erased what happened after. On the back of every single check was an endorsement stamp. For deposit only, Robert R. Voss. My dad's handwriting or the bank stamp he used for the joint account. Every one of them had cleared. Every one of them had been deposited into the account my parents used for everyday spending. The same account, I'd later learn, that my mother had quietly drained down to under $400 by the spring of 2024. I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop and just stared at 19 pieces of evidence that I already knew were true. It wasn't relief, exactly. It was more like holding a receipt for something you already knew you bought, except the person accusing you of shoplifting is your mother, and the audience was your entire extended family. I texted my mother a photo of the first and last check, no caption. She left me on read for 6 hours, then called instead of texting back. Those don't prove anything, she said. You wrote checks. That doesn't mean the loan was paid off. Maybe that was for something else. Mom, the memo line says loan repayment 3 of 20 on this one. There was a pause, not a confused pause, a calculating one. I'd heard that pause before, growing up, right before she changed the subject to something about my brother. I think we should let Whitney's father-in-law handle this, she finally said. He's a lawyer. Whitney's father-in-law, being a divorce attorney in Cincinnati, was not, in fact, the professional this situation called for, but it told me something. My mother wanted this handled by someone who wouldn't ask about the trust. She wanted it handled by someone loyal to the family narrative, not someone independent. That's when I called Marcus. Not because I trusted him more than my mother. Trust wasn't really the word for how I felt about my brother in that period of my life, but because he was the only other person who might know what was actually going on with the estate before the official reading. He picked up on the fourth ring, background noise, like he was at a bar on a Monday afternoon, which in retrospect should have told me plenty on its own. Danny, hey. Look, I don't want to get in the middle of you and Mom's thing. I'm not asking you to get in the middle. I'm asking if you know why she's suddenly telling everyone I never paid back a loan I paid back 5 years ago, 3 weeks before the trust reading. Another pause. Shorter than my mother's, but there. I genuinely don't know what you're talking about, he said, and for the first time in the conversation I believed him completely, which turned out to be its own kind of clue because it meant whatever was happening, my mother hadn't looped him in either. Whatever this was, it wasn't a two-person plan against me. It was a one-person plan that used me as cover for something else. I didn't know yet what that something else was. But I just learned my brother wasn't in on it, and that meant the story my mother was telling wasn't really about protecting the family from me. It was about protecting something, or someone, from the rest of the family. The trust reading was scheduled for December 18th at the office of Halloran and Bright, the estate attorney my grandmother had used for the last 11 years of her life. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitfield, died in September at 88, sharp as ever until a stroke took her fast and mercifully. She'd left behind a trust worth just over $612,000 after the sale of her house in Dayton, to be split equally 3 ways between her grandchildren. Me, Marcus, and our cousin Whitney, my Aunt Pam's daughter. My mother, Carol, was named trustee, not a beneficiary of that particular pot of money, but the person responsible for managing and distributing it. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. 2 days before the reading, I got an email from Mr. Halloran's paralegal, a woman named Deb, asking if I could come in early, separately, to review a documentation matter related to prior advancements against your share. I didn't know what an advancement was in trust language, so I looked it up. An advancement is when a beneficiary receives money early, a loan, a gift, an early distribution, and the trustee deducts that amount from their final share so everyone ends up even. It's a completely normal, completely legal thing trustees do. Which meant my mother wasn't just bad-mouthing me at Thanksgiving. She had formally told the estate attorney that my $22,400 loan from 2018 counted as an early advancement against my inheritance, and that it had never been repaid. I brought the check images to that meeting, all 19, printed front and back, with the corresponding bank statement showing the deposits landing in my parents' joint account. Mr. Halloran, a soft-spoken man in his 60s with reading glasses perched halfway down his nose, went through them slowly. He didn't say much. Lawyers who have been doing this a long time rarely do. In my experience, they let the silence do the work. These are compelling, he finally said. I'll need to speak with your mother obviously before I can revise the distribution memo. But Miss Voss, he caught himself, Danielle, I want to ask you something and I want you to think carefully before you answer. I nodded. Do you know of any other advancements your mother has documented against your brother's share or your cousin's? I said no, I genuinely didn't. But the question sat wrong with me the whole drive home, the way a word sits wrong when you've used it correctly, but something about the sentence still feels off. Why would he ask that unless there was already something strange in the paperwork about someone else? I called my Aunt Pam that night. Pam is my mother's younger sister by 3 years, and where my mother has always been the one who manages appearances, Pam has always been the one who says the thing everyone's thinking at dinner and then apologizes for it later. If anyone in this family was going to tell me something honest, it was her. Danny, honey, I don't know the details, she said, but I'll tell you what I do know. Your mother took out a home equity loan on her house back in February. $85,000. She told me it was for a roof and a kitchen remodel. Did she remodel her kitchen? Her kitchen looks exactly the same as it did in 2019. I sat with that for a long moment. $85,000 is a specific kind of number, not enough to be a mystery windfall, but enough to require an explanation eventually to someone. My mother had spent 11 months explaining it to her sister as home renovations that never happened. And now, 3 weeks before a trust reading where she controlled the disbursement, she'd suddenly remembered that I owed the family $22,400. I didn't have the full shape of it yet, but I had 2 numbers that didn't add up to anything my mother had told anyone, and a lawyer who was asking careful questions about other advancements, like he already suspected there was more than one. Before I hung up with Pam that night, I asked her one more question almost as an afterthought. Did Mom ever ask you for money for anything this past year? Pam laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound. She asked me in March if I could front her $3,000 for 2 weeks, said it was a timing issue with a CD maturing. I gave it to her because that's what sisters do, and she paid me back 9 days later, right on schedule. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Now I keep turning it over in my head, wondering what the $3,000 was actually timing. I wrote that down too, on a legal pad I'd started keeping in my kitchen drawer, right under the date of the HELOC and the number Mr. Halloran had used, prior advancements, plural. A $3,000 bridge loan from a sister, repaid precisely on schedule, sat oddly next to an $85,000 home equity loan that had supposedly gone toward a kitchen that looked untouched. Neither number on its own proved anything. Together, they read like a woman constantly moving small amounts of money around to cover gaps that kept reopening somewhere else. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept thinking about how normal my mother had sounded on the phone with Pam, asking for a short-term favor the way anyone might, and how easily that kind of request disappears into the ordinary noise of a family's finances until you go back and line the dates up on purpose. I want to slow down here, because this is the part where the story stopped being about me and started being about something much bigger that I'd walked into sideways. The week after my conversation with Aunt Pam, I did something I'm not entirely proud of. I called my brother's ex-business partner. Marcus had opened a restaurant in 2023, a modern southern place called Rue and Vine, in the Short North District, the kind of concept that gets a glowing write-up in a local magazine and closes 18 months later owing money to 3 different vendors. I knew it had failed. I didn't know how or with whose money. His business partner, a guy named Tamaz who'd left the venture in early 2024 after what he described to me as a financial situation that had nothing to do with the food, was surprisingly willing to talk. People usually are when they feel like they were the only reasonable one in a room full of chaos and finally have someone to tell. Marcus put in 60 grand of his own to start, Tamaz told me over coffee. Which, fine, that's his money, his call. But by month 8 we needed another injection to cover payroll and the lease, and Marcus said his mom was handling it. I never saw a business loan come through. I never saw an investor. I just saw the payroll clear on the 15th and the 30th month after month like clockwork, until suddenly it didn't anymore, and Marcus told me the family well had run dry. The family well? His words, not mine. I did some rough math sitting in that coffee shop. If my mother had been quietly covering payroll and lease gaps at Rue and Vine for the better part of a year before the restaurant finally folded in March, An $85,000 home equity loan taken out in February started to look less like a mystery, and a lot more like a Band-Aid applied right before the wound got too big to hide. Here's the piece that took me the longest to understand, and it's the piece that finally made the whole picture click. My grandmother's trust wasn't just sitting untouched in an account waiting for the December reading. Trusts like hers, once the death certificate is filed and probate begins, often allow the trustee limited authority to make interim disbursements for approved expenses, funeral costs, estate taxes, upkeep on the property before it sells. My mother, as trustee, had that authority starting the day my grandmother died in September. I didn't know yet whether she'd used it, but I now understood exactly why she needed a story, and why that story needed to be about me specifically, and why it needed to exist in front of witnesses before December 18th. If the final numbers came up short, if Marcus and I and Whitney sat down expecting $204,000 each, and the account didn't have $612,000 in it anymore, my mother needed a reason on record, agreed upon by the family, for why my share specifically would look smaller. Not Marcus's, mine, because if Marcus's share came up short too, someone might start asking where the money actually went, and the answer led straight back to Rue and Vine and straight back to her. I was never the target. I was the explanation. I sat with that realization for a long time before I did anything about it. It's a strange, specific kind of grief, understanding that you weren't hated, you were just useful, that your whole life of being dependable had, at some point, quietly been filed away as a resource rather than a relationship. I didn't cry about it right away. I think I was too busy doing math, running the numbers over and over on that legal pad, checking and rechecking whether I'd misread something, because part of me still wanted there to be an innocent explanation. There wasn't one, and once I accepted that, the question stopped being, is this really happening, and became, what am I going to do about it, and how carefully? I've never been an impulsive person, even as a kid. I was the one who read the instructions before assembling anything, and this was not going to be the moment I started acting on instinct instead of evidence. If I was going to challenge my own mother in front of a lawyer, an accountant, and eventually possibly a judge, I needed to be right about every single detail before I said a word out loud. I need to tell you about my father here because without him, none of what happened next would have been possible. My dad, Robert Voss, was an electrical engineer who kept meticulous personal records his entire life, not out of suspicion of anyone, just because that's who he was. He balanced his checkbook by hand until the week he died in 2021, heart attack, 66 years old, at his desk with a ledger open in front of him. After he passed, my mother boxed up most of his home office and put it in the attic. I know this because I helped her do it. Grief makes people move fast sometimes, faster than they should, and I remember thinking at the time that we were packing away 20 years of his handwriting a little too efficiently. In early December, I asked my mother if I could come by and get some of Dad's old fishing gear for a cousin's kid who'd taken an interest. It wasn't really about the fishing gear. I wanted an excuse to be in that attic. She said sure, she'd be out most of the afternoon anyway, which, in hindsight, was its own kind of tell. 6 weeks earlier, she'd been treating me like a hostile witness. Now she was handing me a key to her house without a second thought, because in her mind, the loan issue had already been handled by simply repeating her version of events loudly enough. I found 4 banker's boxes in that attic. Tax returns going back to 2005, old warranty cards, and in the third box a green ledger book with a rubber band around it, the kind you buy at an office supply store, filled with my father's small, careful handwriting. He'd tracked our loan. Both of ours, mine and Marcus's actually, which I hadn't known before that afternoon. In 2016, 2 years before my loan, Marcus had borrowed $9,000 for a car repair and a security deposit on an apartment. My father's ledger showed 3 payments toward it, totaling $2,100 made in early 2017. Then nothing. The rest, $6,900, sat there, unpaid for 8 years, tracked faithfully by a man who apparently never brought it up at a single Thanksgiving. And there, on the page dated November 2020 in my father's handwriting, 4 words that made me sit down on the attic floor: Danny, paid in full. Underlined twice. My father had known. My father had recorded it in ink in a book he kept for exactly this purpose, which meant my mother hadn't misremembered anything. At some point after he died, she had gone looking through exactly this kind of record, or she'd simply chosen to forget what she already knew, because a paid-off daughter's debt was less useful to her than an unpaid one. I photographed every page of that ledger with my phone. Marcus's $6,900 still owed. My $22,400 paid in full. And on the very last used page, dated 4 months before my father died, a note that had nothing to do with either of us. C asked about second mortgage on house again, told her no, too risky at our age, restaurant idea for M. Not sound. My father had said no to this in writing before he died, and within 2 years of his death my mother had done it anyway. I didn't confront my mother that day. I sat in my car outside her house for 20 minutes with the ledger photos open on my phone, and I made a decision that I still think was the right one, even though it cost me time I didn't love losing. I wasn't going to handle this myself. I was going to bring in someone whose job it was to be right about numbers, because I knew myself well enough to know that anger makes people sloppy, and I didn't want to hand my mother a reason to say I was exaggerating or misreading things. I called Mr. Halloran's office and asked, point blank, whether the trust had a mechanism for requesting a formal accounting, a full record of every transaction the trustee had made since my grandmother's death. Deb, the paralegal, told me that as a named beneficiary, I absolutely had the right to request one, and that Ohio law actually required the trustee to provide it within a reasonable time of a written request. I sent that request the next morning. Certified mail, because I wanted a record that it had been received, and I wanted my mother to open an envelope in front of no one and understand, privately, that this was no longer a conversation she could manage with a wine glass and a room full of relatives. 2 weeks passed. 2 weeks of my mother not calling me, not texting me, and according to Aunt Pam, telling anyone who'd listen that I was trying to tear this family apart over money right when we're supposed to be grieving your grandmother. I want to be honest about how that period felt, because it wasn't triumphant. It was lonely. My cousin Whitney texted me once to ask if everything was okay, and when I told her the short version, she went quiet for 2 days before responding with a single line. I don't want to be in the middle of this. I understood it. I didn't love it, but I understood it. Nobody wants to be the person who picks a side in a family fight over money, even when one side has the receipts. The accounting finally came, not from my mother directly, but forwarded through Mr. Halloran's office, because apparently my mother had asked him to be the one to send it, which told me she already knew what was in it and didn't want to be the one explaining it to my face. It was 11 pages. Most of it was mundane: funeral costs, a property tax payment, a modest fee to a cleaning service that had prepped my grandmother's house for sale. And then, on page 7, a single-line item dated October 30th. Disbursement, household emergency, see Voss discretion per trustee provision 4.2, $41,000. $41,000 disbursed to herself 5 weeks after my grandmother's death, a full 7 weeks before the scheduled reading, labeled as a household emergency. I called Priya Nair that afternoon. Priya is a forensic accountant a coworker had used during her own divorce, and I'd kept her card in my wallet for 11 months without ever thinking I'd need it for something like this. I sent her everything: the checks, the ledger photos, the 11-page accounting, and asked her one question. Does this add up to anything, or am I imagining a pattern that isn't there? She called me back in 4 days. You're not imagining anything, she said. This adds up to a pattern. It's just going to take some digging to prove where the $41,000 actually went. Before we hung up, Priya asked me a practical question that I hadn't thought to ask myself yet. Was I prepared for what happened if this went further than an internal family disagreement? Forensic accountants see a lot of families at their worst, and she'd clearly had this conversation before, more than once. I'm not trying to send my mother to jail, I told her. I'm trying to get the trust distributed the way my grandmother actually wanted it. That's the right instinct, she said. Civil trust disputes rarely turn criminal unless someone escalates it that way on purpose. Keep your documentation organized, keep your communications calm and in writing where you can, and let the attorney drive the legal strategy. Your job is just to make sure nothing gets thrown away. That last sentence stuck with me for days. Make sure nothing gets thrown away. I thought about the boxes in my mother's attic, how efficiently we'd packed my father's office away 18 months earlier, how close I'd come to never opening that green ledger at all. If I hadn't needed an excuse to be in that house that particular afternoon, if my mother hadn't happened to be out, if Marcus's kid cousin had never mentioned liking fishing. The whole chain of small, unremarkable coincidences that led me to the one piece of evidence that mattered most. I started keeping copies of everything in two places after that, a folder on my laptop backed up to a cloud drive, and a physical folder in a fireproof box at my apartment. It felt paranoid at the time. In hindsight, it felt like exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous carefulness my father would have approved of. Priya worked fast, in the way people work when they've seen this exact shape of story more times than they'd like to count. She pulled public records on the home equity loan. Those filings are a matter of public record in Ohio, tied to the property deed, and confirmed the $85,000 HELOC my mother had taken out in February, 6 months before my grandmother even died. Then she did something I wouldn't have thought to do. She cross-referenced the dates of the HELOC disbursements against the timeline Tamaz had given me for Rue and Vine's payroll struggles. 4 withdrawals from the HELOC, each between $12,000 and $22,000, landing in my mother's checking account between February and August of last year, every single one within a week of a payroll date Tamaz remembered scrambling to make. And then the trust's $41,000 household emergency disbursement in October. Priya found it had moved, 3 days after it cleared, into a joint account my mother shared with Marcus, an account he'd opened with her 2 years earlier, back when Rue and Vine was still an idea on a napkin and she'd wanted to help him get established. $41,000. The same week, according to Tamaz, that a supplier had threatened to sue Rue and Vine over an unpaid invoice for produce and dry goods, an invoice that, as it turned out, got paid in full right around then, even though the restaurant itself had already been shuttered for months. My mother wasn't just covering a failed restaurant's day-to-day expenses anymore. She was using my dead grandmother's estate to quietly settle Marcus's old business debts, 5 weeks after the funeral, using a discretionary trustee provision meant for genuine emergencies. A burst pipe, a medical bill, not a supplier threatening legal action over a business that had already closed. Here's where I have to be fair to her because I promised myself I would be, even now. My mother is not a cruel person. I've turned this over in my head more times than I can count, and the picture I keep landing on isn't a villain twirling a mustache. It's a woman who watched her son fail publicly once before, a car dealership venture in his 20s that ended with a repossessed inventory and a humiliating write-up in the local business paper, and who could not, emotionally, survive watching it happen a second time in front of the whole extended family. Marcus was always the one she worried about. I was always the one she assumed would be fine because I'd never given her a reason to think otherwise, and somewhere along the way, fine became a kind of invisibility. She wasn't protecting Marcus from consequences because she thought he deserved a pass. I think she was protecting herself from having to watch him fail again, and from what that failure might say in her mind about her as a mother. None of that makes it okay, but it made it make sense, and understanding it didn't make me less determined to fix it. It just made the whole thing sadder than I expected it to feel. Priya's final report ran to 19 pages. She sent it to me on a Sunday night with a one-line email. This is more than enough for the attorney. I'd sit down with him before the 18th, not after. I got the meeting moved up to December 14th, 4 days before the scheduled reading, at Mr. Halloran's request once he'd seen Priya's report. My mother was invited, she didn't come. She sent a text instead to me, not to the attorney. Whatever you think you found, you're going to regret doing this to this family. You have no idea what you're accusing me of. I read that message maybe 6 times before I understood it wasn't a denial. It was a warning dressed up as one. The meeting itself was quieter than I expected. Mr. Halloran walked through the check images first, confirming what he already believed, that my 2018 loan had been fully repaid by November 2020, and that the advancement my mother had documented against my share was, in his words, not supported by any evidence in the file and directly contradicted by evidence outside it. He struck it from the draft distribution memo in front of me, which felt anticlimactic in a way I hadn't expected. Weeks of anxiety resolved with one sentence and a strike-through. Then he moved to the $41,000 disbursement, and the tone in the room changed. Trustee Provision 4.2 exists for genuine, verifiable household emergencies incurred by the beneficiaries or the estate, he said. not for the discretionary personal use of the trustee. Based on what's been provided, this disbursement appears to have been used to satisfy a personal business debt unrelated to the estate. That's not a gray area. That's a breach of fiduciary duty. He used that phrase, breach of fiduciary duty, like it was a simple factual description, which legally it was. But hearing it out loud about my own mother in a conference room with a box of tissues placed a little too conveniently on the table was its own kind of gut punch, even though I'd known it was coming. Aunt Pam was there too. Mr. Halloran had asked her to attend as a co-beneficiary's guardian since Whitney was traveling for work. Pam didn't say much through most of the meeting, but when Mr. Halloran laid out the HELOC timeline next to the trust withdrawal, she put her hand over her mouth and didn't take it away for almost a full minute. She told me it was a kitchen, Pam finally said quietly to no one in particular. Mr. Halloran explained our options. The trust could petition the probate court to have my mother removed as trustee with a neutral fiduciary or a co-beneficiary appointed in her place. She could be required to repay the $41,000 to the trust corpus before final distribution, which would come directly out of her own assets, not out of Marcus's or Whitney's shares. And separately, though this wasn't his area, the improperly withheld advancement claim against me meant my original third would be restored in full, no deduction, once the corrected accounting was filed. What happens to Marcus's share? I asked, because somewhere in all of this, I still didn't want my brother to end up collateral damage for a mess he genuinely hadn't known about. Nothing happens to Marcus's share, Mr. Halloran said, unless it comes out that he was aware of how these funds were being used and knowingly benefited from a breach. Was he? I didn't know. That was the honest answer, and it was the one I gave. Mr. Halloran nodded, made a note, and told us the court would likely want to interview Marcus directly if the removal petition moved forward not as an accused party, but as a witness who could speak to what he'd been told and when. He said it gently, but it landed on me hard anyway. My little brother, who'd spent his whole adult life being protected from consequences, was about to sit across from a probate investigator and answer questions about money he never asked to be involved with in the first place. Aunt Pam walked me out to the parking garage afterward. Neither of us said much for the first minute or so, just the sound of our shoes on concrete and the hum of the fluorescent lights. I keep thinking about the last conversation I had with your grandmother, she finally said. About 2 weeks before she passed, she pulled me aside at that Sunday lunch and told me she wanted to make sure things were fair when the time came. I thought she meant the will itself. She'd already told us the split was equal, 3 ways, no favorites. I didn't understand until just now that she might have been telling me she didn't fully trust your mother to keep it that way. I hadn't thought about my grandmother in the middle of all this, not really, not beyond the abstract fact of her estate. Hearing Pam say that put her back into the story as a person instead of a number, a woman who'd apparently sensed something was off even in her last weeks and had tried in her own indirect way to leave a warning behind. I called Marcus that night. I'd been putting it off for exactly the reason you're probably thinking. Some part of me wanted to protect him from this the way our mother apparently had been trying to, and some smaller, less generous part of me wondered whether he'd known all along and simply let me take the fall for a story that was never about me. He didn't know. I believed him within the first 30 seconds because the sound he made when I told him about the $41,000 wasn't defensive. It was the sound of someone hearing something break that they didn't know was cracked. She told me the restaurant money was a loan from her retirement account, he said. She told me I'd pay her back over 10 years, low interest like a real loan. I signed a paper and everything. I thought, Danny, I genuinely thought this was between me and her. I didn't know Grandma's money was anywhere near this. You signed a paper? Yeah, like a promissory note thing. She had it printed and everything? That detail actually helped him, as it turned out. It meant Marcus believed he was repaying his mother directly, out of what he understood to be her own retirement savings, not knowingly receiving stolen trust funds. He was naive, maybe willfully so in the way people are when a convenient story arrives right when they need one. But naive isn't the same as complicit, and Mr. Halloran later agreed that the promissory note, however informal, supported the idea that Marcus believed the money's origin was legitimate. What Marcus didn't know, what none of us fully understood until Priya kept digging, was that the promissory note itself had never been for the full amount. It listed $60,000, the number that roughly matched what our mother had told him she was lending from her retirement. The other $85,000 from the HELOC and the $41,000 from the trust weren't on any note at all. They were just money that appeared exactly when the restaurant needed it, with no paper trail Marcus had ever seen or signed for. My mother hadn't just been protecting Marcus from failure. She'd been managing what he knew carefully, the same way she'd managed what the rest of the family believed about me. Two different stories built for two different audiences, both designed to keep the real shape of the money hidden a little longer. I didn't feel triumphant learning that. I felt tired. There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from realizing a person you've spent your whole life trying to read correctly has been building parallel versions of reality for everyone around her, and you were just the version that was easiest to sacrifice. Marcus asked me what I was going to do. I told him the truth, that it wasn't really my decision alone anymore. The petition to remove our mother as trustee, once Mr. Halloran filed it, would go to a probate judge, and probate judges don't care about family Thanksgivings or old grudges. They care about fiduciary law and paperwork, and on both counts my mother didn't have much of a defense. The petition was filed on January 9th. I won't pretend the next stretch of this story moved quickly, because it didn't, and I think it's worth saying that clearly, because so many of these stories online skip straight from the truth came out to justice was served, and that's not how any of this actually works. Probate court moves on its own calendar. Our first hearing date wasn't until February 25th, which meant almost 7 weeks of my mother still technically holding trustee authority, still technically able to make disbursements. Though Mr. Halloran filed an emergency motion asking the court to freeze her discretionary powers pending the hearing, which the judge granted within 4 days, thankfully, once he saw the accounting discrepancy in writing. During those 7 weeks, my mother stopped speaking to me entirely. Not a dramatic cutoff, just silence, the kind that used to terrify me as a kid and now mostly just made me sad. She spoke to Marcus. She stopped speaking to Pam almost entirely, which surprised me, until Pam told me she'd finally said out loud to my mother's face that she couldn't keep pretending the kitchen renovation excuse made sense. I want to tell you I felt strong and certain through all of this, but there were nights I doubted myself badly. There was a Tuesday in late January where I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot and genuinely wondered if I was the villain of this story. A daughter dragging her grieving mother through probate court over money, 3 months after burying her own mother. I called my therapist's after-hours line that night, which I'd never done before. She helped me separate two things I'd been tangling together. My mother's grief over losing her own mom was real, and it did not make the $41,000 disbursement any less of a breach. Both things were true, neither one canceled out the other. The hearing itself, when it finally came, lasted less than 2 hours. My mother had retained an attorney by then, not Whitney's father-in-law, thankfully, but a real estate litigation lawyer who, from what I could tell, spent most of the hearing trying to argue that Trustee Provision 4.2's language around household emergency was ambiguous enough to cover a supplier lawsuit threat against a family member's business. The judge, a woman named Delacroix Ames, who did not seem interested in spending her Tuesday afternoon entertaining that argument, asked a single clarifying question. Whose household and whose emergency? My mother's attorney didn't have a good answer because there wasn't one. The disbursement had gone to settle a debt belonging to Marcus's now-defunct business, not to any household expense of the estate or its beneficiaries. The judge ruled from the bench. My mother was removed as trustee, effective immediately. Aunt Pam was appointed successor trustee, with the understanding that Mr. Halloran's office would supervise the final distribution directly. My mother was ordered to repay the $41,000 to the trust corpus within 90 days, from her own assets, with interest calculated from the date of disbursement. I watched my mother during those final minutes of the hearing more than I watched the judge. She sat very straight, hands folded on the table in front of her, the same posture she used to make us hold at church when we were kids. She didn't cry, she didn't argue. When the judge finished reading the order, she simply said, "Understood, Your Honor," in a voice so steady it almost convinced me she'd expected this outcome all along. Outside the courthouse, in the cold, thin light of a late February afternoon, she walked past me without stopping, got into her car, and drove away. We didn't speak. I stood on the courthouse steps for a few minutes afterward with Pam, both of us a little stunned by how anticlimactic the actual moment of winning felt compared to the months of dread leading up to it. I didn't feel like celebrating when it was over. I felt like I'd finally set down something heavy I'd been carrying since Thanksgiving, and my arms just ached from having held it so long. The 90-day repayment period turned out to be its own small drama, because my mother's assets, once you actually looked at them, weren't nearly as liquid as anyone assumed. Between the $85,000 HELOC and whatever equity she'd already burned through covering the restaurant before that, she didn't have $41,000 sitting anywhere convenient. She ended up having to sell a small parcel of land in Kentucky that had belonged to my father's side of the family, land I don't think she ever wanted to part with, based on how many times over the years I'd heard her talk about keeping it for the grandkids someday. She made the final payment into the trust account on day 86. Aunt Pam confirmed it and let me know by text, 4 words, money's in. It's done. The trust finally distributed in April, 5 months later than the original December date, but distributed correctly. $204,000 each to me, Marcus, and Whitney, no deductions, no advancements. Exactly the way my grandmother's will had actually intended it. Marcus paid down what he genuinely owed on the terms of that promissory note, treating it now as a debt to the estate rather than to our mother personally, since Mr. Halloran's office had restructured it that way as part of the settlement. He still owes about $34,000 of it as of this recording, paying it off in monthly installments, and to his credit, every single payment has come through on time. I want to tell you my relationship with my mother snapped back together neatly once the legal side was resolved, but that's not what happened, and I think it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. We didn't speak for almost 4 months after the hearing. The first time we did, it was at Whitney's engagement party in May, both of us standing near the drink table, both clearly trying to figure out whether to acknowledge each other at all. She said, "I'm not going to apologize the way you probably want me to." I said, "I'm not waiting for a specific speech, Mom. I just want to know if you understand what actually happened." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised me, not an excuse, not a justification, just a plain sentence. "I decided a long time ago that Marcus needed protecting and you didn't. I don't think I ever really asked myself if that was fair to you. I'm asking myself that now." It wasn't an apology. It also wasn't nothing. I've learned slowly that some relationships don't get resolved with a clean ending. They get renegotiated awkwardly over a series of smaller moments that don't make for a very satisfying highlight reel, but are more honest than a dramatic reconciliation scene would be. I think about the ledger a lot. My father's small, careful handwriting, Danny, paid in full, underlined twice, sitting quietly in a box in an attic for 3 years while a completely different story got told about what those pages actually contained. I keep a photo of that page on my phone still. Not because I need the proof anymore. The trust is settled, the record is corrected, the number is right in Mr. Halloran's file and in the county probate record now permanently, if anyone ever wanted to check. I keep it because it reminds me of something that took me a long time to actually believe. The truth doesn't need me to defend it loudly. It just needs to still exist somewhere on paper, waiting for someone to go looking. My mother and I talk now maybe twice a month, careful conversations about nothing important, her garden, my job, whether Marcus's restaurant debt payment cleared on time. We haven't talked about the $41,000 again since that day at Whitney's engagement party, and I don't know if we ever fully will. Some things, I've come to think, don't get resolved with a conversation. They get carried differently afterward, a little lighter maybe, but never fully set down. Whitney and I are closer now than we were before any of this happened, oddly enough. She apologized eventually for going quiet during the worst of it, and told me she'd been terrified of picking a side in something she didn't understand yet. I told her I got it, I really did. Nobody teaches you how to stand next to someone during something like this, especially when the person on the other side raised you too. Marcus and I talk more now than we ever did growing up. I think losing the comfortable story he'd been told, that this was a private loan between him and Mom, low interest, no consequences, actually cracked something open in him that needed cracking. He's working a steady job now, nothing glamorous, saving toward opening something smaller and slower someday, he says, something he can actually afford without anyone else's money propping it up. I believe him. I also believe people can say that and still repeat old patterns, so I'm watching gently the way you watch someone you love without hovering. If you'd asked me a year ago what justice would feel like in a situation like this, I think I would have described something closer to what you see in movies. A dramatic confrontation, a clean villain, a satisfying collapse. What I actually got was quieter than that. A corrected legal document. A land sale in Kentucky I still feel a little sad about. A mother who said one honest sentence to me at an engagement party instead of the apology I used to think I needed. I've also had to make peace with the parts of this that never got resolved and probably never will. I don't know, for instance, whether my mother would have told the truth eventually on her own, given enough time, or whether she would have let the story about my unpaid loan quietly calcify into fact, repeated at enough holidays that it simply became what the family remembered, the way stories sometimes do when nobody's left to correct them. I don't know if she's told her book club friend, the one who was there that first Thanksgiving, what actually happened. Some threads just don't get tied off. I've stopped needing them to. What I do know is that I stopped flinching every time my phone rang with her name on it. That took months longer than the legal process did. Here's what I keep coming back to, almost a year later. My mother didn't lie about me because she hated me. I've had to sit with that for a long time because it would honestly be easier if she had. It would make the story simpler. But the truth is messier than that. She lied about me because I was safe to lie about. Because I'd spent 30-some years being the child who didn't cause problems, who paid her debts on time, who didn't need managing, and somewhere in that dynamic, my reliability quietly turned into my expendability. It was never really about the $22,000. It was about who she believed could absorb a hit without the whole family falling apart. I don't say that looking for sympathy. I say it because I think a lot of people watching this might recognize the shape of it, even if the specific numbers and names are different. The dependable one in the family isn't always dependable because it's easy. Sometimes it's dependable because nobody ever gave them permission to be anything else, and being quietly overlooked started to feel like the price of being trusted. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've resisted wrapping it up too neatly, because real families rarely close on a clean moral, I think it's this. Keep your own records, not because you expect to need them, and not because you assume the people you love are lying to you. Keep them because memory is soft, and stories calcify over time into whatever shape is most convenient for the person telling them. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and someone else's convenient version of events is a slip of paper you almost threw away. My father kept that ledger for reasons that had nothing to do with catching anyone in a lie. He kept it because he was careful, and because he believed numbers should mean what they say. I think about him more now than I did before any of this happened, not sadly exactly, just gratefully. In a strange way, the most honest witness in this entire story had been gone for 3 years before any of it came to light, and he still managed to have the last word. I don't know if my mother and I will ever get back to something that feels easy. I've made a kind of peace with that. What I do know is that I stopped being the explanation for someone else's shortfall, and I did it with evidence instead of anger, which mattered to me more than I expected it to. That's not a triumphant ending, it's just an honest one, and most days I've realized that's enough.